Imagine a war where the difference between life and death wasn't just firepower or numbers, but secrecy, cunning, and timing. In the midst of chaos, there are stories that never make it to the history books. Stories of operations so covert, so brilliantly executed that the enemy never even knew they had been hit. This is one of those stories, a tale of strategy, courage, and the kind of audacity that turns the tide of battles, yet remains hidden in the shadows, almost as if it never happened at all. It was the height of the conflict, and one front had stalled. Soldiers were entrenched, morale was faltering, and commanders were desperate for a way to break the deadlock. Conventional attacks had failed. Bombardments had barely dented the enemy's defenses. It seemed like the war would grind on endlessly, leaving countless lives hanging in the balance. That's when the idea came, a plan so bold it seemed almost reckless. But in warfare, sometimes the most unexpected moves are the ones that succeed. The operation was assigned to a select few, the kind of soldiers who thrived in shadows, moving silently where others would be seen. These men weren't chosen for their rank or their fame, they were chosen for their skill, their discipline, and their willingness to walk into danger without a second thought. They trained in secret, preparing for a mission that could either end in spectacular success or total annihilation. Every detail had to be perfect. Every timing had to be precise. In a world where one mistake could mean the death of dozens, precision wasn't just important, it was everything. What made this operation unique wasn't just its audacity. It was the complete invisibility of it. The enemy had no clue it was coming. No spies, no reconnaissance, no warnings. It was as if the attack came from nowhere, striking with a force that stunned them and vanishing before they could retaliate. The psychological impact alone was devastating. Armies trained for months, expecting one kind of engagement, and were instead hit by something completely different. Confusion reigned. Command structures faltered, and in the midst of that chaos, the mission achieved its objective with surgical precision. History often remembers the loud, the visible, the battles with headlines and monuments. But some of the most brilliant feats happen quietly. In this case, the hidden operation not only changed the course of a campaign, it saved countless lives. It shifted momentum, creating opportunities for others to press forward, and the people who made it happen. Their names would remain unknown, their stories untold, except in whispers, in personal accounts, and in the records of those who witnessed the miracle unfold. What's incredible is how small the team was. This wasn't a massive assault with hundreds of soldiers storming the front lines. It was a compact, highly trained unit operating behind enemy lines, using ingenuity, stealth, and an intimate knowledge of the terrain to outsmart forces far larger than themselves. Every step had to be calculated, every choice carried weight, and yet, despite the risk, they pressed forward. Courage in such situations isn't just bravery, it's a kind of cold, focused calculation, the kind that comes from knowing failure isn't an option. And then came the execution. Under the cover of darkness they moved. Every movement was silent, every signal precise. Enemy patrols passed mere feet away, completely unaware that their fate was already being decided. The team hit critical points, sabotaging infrastructure, cutting communications, and striking at the heart of the enemy's operations. And when the final objective was secured, they vanished, leaving no trace. By the time the enemy realized what had happened, the damage was done, irreversible, and the advantage had shifted irreversibly. This is a story that deserves attention because it reminds us that wars aren't won solely by sheer force. Strategy, courage, and creativity can tilt outcomes in ways that raw numbers cannot. It reminds us of the men and women who operate in shadows, whose actions are critical, yet who are often forgotten by history. Their sacrifices, ingenuity, and determination changed the course of events, and yet their stories remain largely hidden. As you watch this, imagine what it would be like to be one of those soldiers, knowing that your actions are invisible, that success means lives are saved, and that failure could mean everything is lost. That is the essence of the hidden operation the enemy never expected, a perfect blend of courage, cunning, and execution at the highest level. To truly understand the brilliance of this mission, we need to go behind the lines, not the enemy's, but those of planning and preparation. Unlike conventional battles where armies march and clash in the open, this operation relied entirely on anticipation and intelligence. Every soldier involved had to analyze the enemy's mindset, predict their movements, and prepare for contingencies that seemed almost impossible. The team spent days studying maps, memorizing patrol routes, and learning the subtle rhythms of enemy behavior. They weren't just soldiers, they were detectives, analysts, and strategists rolled into one. But it wasn't only about observation. The team had to experiment with tactics in the field, often in conditions that mirrored the mission environment. They rehearsed for days in makeshift terrain that simulated enemy strongholds. Every movement was scrutinized, every error corrected, every contingency considered. Imagine crawling through mud and freezing rain, silent and still for hours, listening to nothing but the wind and distant footsteps, knowing that even a single sound could betray your presence. That level of discipline is almost unimaginable, yet for these soldiers, it became second nature. Tools of the operation were just as unconventional. Unlike traditional assaults, which rely on heavy artillery, tanks, or sheer manpower, this team depended on ingenuity. Improvised explosives, hidden communications, and even psychological tricks were part of their arsenal. They had to think several steps ahead, anticipating how the enemy would react to each move and preparing countermeasures before a single action was taken. One miscalculation could blow the mission, or worse, cost lives. Yet, every member of the unit carried out their role with unwavering precision, knowing that their small contribution was critical to the larger goal. One of the most fascinating aspects of the mission was the coordination. The operation wasn't about chaos, it was about timing. Every action had to sync perfectly. If one team moved too soon or too late, the entire plan could collapse. It's a bit like watching a symphony being conducted in near total darkness. Every musician knows their part, and the magic happens when every note aligns flawlessly. In this case, the music was destruction of enemy logistics, disruption of their communication lines, and creating maximum confusion without ever being detected. Even before the operation began, morale was a critical concern. These soldiers weren't the kind to expect recognition. Their motivation had to come from within. Commanders held briefings that weren't just tactical, they were psychological. They painted vivid pictures of success, of the strategic advantage this operation would provide, and the countless lives it could save. They reminded the team that sometimes the quietest victories are the most impactful. By the time the mission was underway, every member was mentally and physically prepared, committed to seeing it through regardless of the personal risk. As the night of the operation arrived, tension hung heavy in the air. The world outside the operation might have seemed calm, but behind the lines, every heartbeat felt amplified. Soldiers whispered final instructions, checked their equipment one last time, and steeled themselves for the moments ahead. And then, without fanfare, they moved. Shadowed by darkness, they slipped past enemy posts, navigated treacherous terrain, and approached targets with a precision that could only be described as surgical. What made this operation remarkable wasn't just the danger, it was the creativity and execution. Instead of direct confrontation, the team used deception and misdirection. They left false trails, planted misleading evidence, and created diversions that pulled the enemy's attention away from their actual objective. By the time the enemy realized the truth, it was already too late. Their resources were crippled, their command disrupted, and their morale shaken. It was a textbook example of asymmetric warfare. The smaller, smarter force striking decisively against a larger opponent and achieving results that brute strength alone could never deliver. Perhaps the most extraordinary part was the human element. These weren't machines, they were men facing fatigue, fear, and uncertainty. But in the heat of the mission, instinct and training took over. They made split-second decisions, adjusted plans on the fly, and relied on each other completely. Trust was absolute. Every soldier knew that the survival of the team and the success of the mission depended on unwavering coordination and belief in each other's abilities. In war, such trust is rare, and when it exists, it can produce feats that seem almost impossible to outsiders. After hours that felt like an eternity, the objectives were completed. Explosives had been set, critical assets neutralized, and the enemy left in disarray. Not a single member of the team had been detected, and yet the damage inflicted was substantial. The psychological blow alone was enough to shift the momentum on the battlefield. When reports finally reached commanders, they were met with stunned silence. How could such a small unit accomplish what seemed impossible without alerting the enemy? This mission stands as a testament to the power of strategy over size, of intellect over force, and of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. It reminds us that the most significant contributions in war aren't always the ones marked by grandeur or glory. Sometimes they happen in silence, away from the spotlight, executed by people who will never see their names in history books, but whose actions change the course of events nonetheless. From the enemy's perspective, the aftermath was nothing short of baffling. Reports flooded in from multiple units, each contradicting the last. Communications went silent in key sectors, supply routes failed without explanation, and entire command chains struggled to understand how so much damage could occur without a single confirmed sighting of Allied troops. Officers suspected sabotage, yet no alarms had been triggered. No firefights had been reported. It was as if the ground itself had turned against them. Confusion spread quickly, and in warfare, confusion is often more dangerous than any weapon. Enemy commanders ordered immediate investigations. Patrols were doubled, checkpoints reinforced, and troops redeployed in haste. But these reactions only worsened the situation. By diverting forces to search for an enemy that had already vanished, they weakened their own front lines. Supplies that were already delayed now faced additional obstacles. Units waited for orders that never came, while others received conflicting commands. The psychological toll of uncertainty began to erode morale. Soldiers who had once felt secure behind strong defensive lines now questioned whether they were ever truly safe. What made the operation especially devastating was that the damage wasn't immediately obvious. Bridges still stood, roads looked intact, and installations appeared functional at first glance. But beneath the surface, systems had been quietly crippled. Timers delayed explosions until repair crews were present. Sabotaged equipment failed at critical moments. Communication relays collapsed just as orders were being issued. The enemy wasn't just reacting to destruction. They were reacting to the fear that more unseen attacks could happen at any time. As panic spread through the ranks, paranoia followed close behind. Commanders began suspecting internal leaks. Soldiers were questioned. Civilians were interrogated. Entire units were reshuffled in search of an explanation that didn't exist. The truth was far simpler and far more unsettling. A small, disciplined team had slipped in, executed their mission flawlessly, and left without a trace. There was no spy network to uncover, no battlefield victory to reclaim. The damage was done, and it couldn't be undone. Meanwhile, on the Allied side, reports of the operation's success were handled with extreme discretion. This wasn't the kind of victory meant for headlines. Broadcasting the details would only help the enemy adapt. Instead, commanders quietly adjusted their plans, exploiting the chaos unfolding behind enemy lines. Advances that had once seemed impossible now faced weakened resistance. Artillery units encountered fewer supplies. Reinforcements arrived late, or not at all. What appeared to be a sudden shift in momentum was, in reality, the delayed effect of a perfectly executed hidden operation. The soldiers who carried out the mission returned without fanfare. There were no parades, no immediate medals, no public recognition. They debriefed, handed over their equipment, and blended back into the larger force. To outsiders, they looked like any other unit, but among themselves, there was a shared understanding of what they had accomplished. Quiet pride, tempered by exhaustion, and the awareness that their success depended on remaining invisible. In some ways, anonymity was the final requirement of the mission. For many of them, the psychological adjustment was difficult. Operating for days in constant tension, where silence meant survival and every shadow carried danger, left a lasting impression. Sleep came in fragments. Sounds triggered reflexive responses. Yet there was also a profound sense of fulfillment. They had done exactly what was asked of them and more. They had proven that intelligence, preparation, and restraint could achieve what brute force could not. That knowledge stayed with them long after the war moved on to its next chapter. Historians later struggled to reconstruct the full scope of the operation. Records were deliberately vague. Reports referenced logistical failures and unexpected enemy disorganization without explanation. Only decades later, through personal letters and declassified documents, did the outline of the mission begin to emerge. Even then, many details remained intentionally obscured. Names were omitted, locations generalized. The operation remained hidden not because it was forgotten, but because secrecy had been essential to its success and its legacy. What makes this story so compelling is not just what happened, but how it happened. No overwhelming force, no dramatic last stand, just patience, planning, and execution at the highest level. The enemy never expected such an approach because it challenged their assumptions about how wars were fought. They prepared for visible threats, not invisible ones. They fortified positions, not mines. And in doing so, they left themselves vulnerable to an operation that rewrote the rules of engagement without ever announcing its presence. This hidden operation reminds us that history's most decisive moments are often the quietest. While battles rage and headlines are written, somewhere in the shadows, small teams are making choices that shape outcomes on a scale far beyond their numbers. Their success is measured not in territory gained, but in lives saved, momentum shifted, and wars short. These are the victories that rarely make monuments. But without them, many wars would have been far longer, far bloodier, and far more uncertain. As the enemy scrambled to recover, never fully understanding what had struck them, the true brilliance of the operation revealed itself. It didn't just win a tactical advantage, it changed the psychological landscape of the war. It introduced doubt where confidence once stood, hesitation where certainty had ruled. And once that seed was planted, it continued to grow, influencing decisions long after the team had disappeared back into history's shadows. In the weeks that followed, the full strategic impact of the hidden operation began to surface. Allied commanders noticed a subtle but unmistakable shift across the front. Enemy movement slowed. Requests for reinforcements increased. Supply convoys that once ran like clockwork now arrived late, underguarded, or not at all. What appeared from a distance to be routine wartime friction was, in reality, the cumulative effect of one perfectly timed disruption. The battlefield had not changed geographically, but its rhythm had been altered, and in war, rhythm often determines victory or defeat. The enemy attempted to adapt, but adaptation requires clarity, and clarity was exactly what they lacked. Without knowing how the damage had been done, they could not effectively prevent it from happening again. Defensive measures were scattered and reactive rather than strategic. More guards were posted, but in the wrong places. Patrols were increased, but along predictable routes. Resources were stretched thin as commanders attempted to protect everything at once, ultimately protecting nothing well. The hidden operation had forced them into a posture of permanent uncertainty. On the Allied side, the success of the mission validated a philosophy that had long been debated but rarely proven so decisively. Intelligence, deception, and small unit precision were no longer theoretical advantages. They were demonstrated realities. Training programs quietly adjusted. Commanders began to prioritize adaptability and independent decision-making. Soldiers were taught not just how to follow orders, but how to think under pressure, how to operate when plans unraveled, and how to trust their instincts when communication failed. The operation became a quiet benchmark, referenced in closed-door briefings and after-action reports as an example of warfare executed at its highest level. For the soldiers who carried out the mission, however, the aftermath was more personal and far less abstract. Once the adrenaline faded, reality set in. The long hours of tension, the constant vigilance, and the weight of responsibility began to surface in unexpected ways. Some found it difficult to sleep. Others replayed moments in their minds, wondering how close they had come to disaster. These reactions were rarely discussed openly. In that era, resilience was expected, and silence was often the default response to psychological strain. Yet beneath the surface, the cost of operating in total secrecy lingered. Despite this, there was a shared sense of meaning that anchored them. They knew what they had accomplished. They understood that lives had been spared because of their restraint and precision. That knowledge carried a quiet power. It wasn't pride in the conventional sense, it was a deep internal certainty that their suffering had purpose. In a war defined by mass casualties and overwhelming destruction, they had succeeded through control, discipline, and restraint. That distinction mattered to them, even if no one else ever knew. The operation also revealed something fundamental about fear. Not the fear of being shot or captured, but the fear of the unknown. By remaining unseen, the team had turned uncertainty into a weapon. The enemy could prepare for tanks, artillery, and aircraft, but how do you defend against an opponent you cannot see, hear, or predict? That psychological pressure proved more disruptive than any single explosion. It eroded confidence, delayed decisions, and forced commanders to second-guess even their most routine actions. In doing so, it magnified the operation's impact far beyond its physical footprint. As months passed, the war moved on as wars always do. New battles replaced old ones. Fresh units rotated into the field. Yet the effects of the hidden operation persisted, embedded in altered strategies and cautious command structures. The enemy never fully recovered the initiative they had lost. Even when they stabilized their supply lines, the hesitation remained. They now knew, without knowing how, that the battlefield could betray them at any moment. Decades later, when fragments of the story finally emerged, historians struggled to capture its significance. Traditional narratives favored dramatic clashes and visible heroics. This operation resisted such framing. There were no famous last stands, no iconic photographs, no triumphant announcements. Its power lay in absence, in what didn't happen because of it. Battles that were never fought, units that never advanced, casualties that were never counted because they never occurred. Measuring such success required a different lens, one focused on prevention rather than spectacle. For modern audiences, this story challenges assumptions about what heroism looks like. It suggests that courage is not always loud and victory is not always visible. Sometimes the most impactful actions are those that leave no trace at all. The soldiers involved accepted this trade-off willingly. They understood that recognition would compromise the very principles that made the mission possible. In choosing invisibility, they ensured effectiveness. The hidden operation also underscores the importance of trust at every level. Trust between commanders and soldiers, trust among team members, trust in training, preparation, and judgment. Without that trust, the mission would have collapsed under the weight of uncertainty. Every individual had to believe not only in the plan, but in the people executing it alongside them. That mutual reliance became the operation's strongest asset, stronger even than weapons or technology. As historians continue to reassess the conflict, operations like this one have gained renewed attention. Not because they're flashy, but because they reveal a deeper truth about warfare and human capability. When faced with overwhelming odds, innovation and discipline can redefine what is possible. Small teams acting with clarity and purpose can influence events far beyond their immediate surroundings. The hidden operation the enemy never expected stands as proof of that reality. And perhaps that is its greatest legacy. Not the damage inflicted, nor the confusion sown, but the reminder that power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it moves quietly, strikes precisely, and disappears before anyone realizes it was ever there. In that silence lies a form of strength that no enemy can easily counter and no history can fully capture. The final phase of the story does not unfold on a battlefield, but in memory, and memory is where this operation truly lives. Long after the gunfire faded and the maps were redrawn, the men who carried it out returned to lives that bore no outward sign of what they had done. They went back to farms, factories, offices, and classrooms. To neighbors and coworkers, they were ordinary veterans with ordinary stories. The operation that had quietly altered the course of a campaign remained locked behind classification stamps and unspoken agreements. Silence became part of the mission, extended indefinitely. For some, that silence was easy to maintain. They compartmentalized the experience, stored it away like a sealed container, only revisited in fleeting moments of reflection. For others, it lingered more heavily. They carried memories that could not be shared, not even with family. There were moments when a newsreel clip or a newspaper headline would hint at events they recognized, and they would feel a private jolt of recognition, knowing the fuller truth behind the simplified version presented to the public. It was a strange kind of isolation, to know you had shaped history without ever being allowed to say so. The military itself treated the operation much the same way. Officially, it was folded into broader strategic outcomes, its details diluted and anonymized. Unofficially, it became a case study whispered about in advanced planning rooms. Instructors spoke of it without names, without dates, using phrases like a small detachment or a limited action. The lessons were passed on quietly, how preparation mattered more than numbers, how patience could outperform aggression, how the absence of evidence could be more powerful than a visible show of force. Those who listened carefully understood that these were not abstract theories, but hard-earned truths. As technology advanced and warfare evolved, the principles behind the hidden operation only grew more relevant. Satellites, drones, and digital surveillance changed the landscape, but they did not eliminate uncertainty. If anything, they made it more valuable. The operation demonstrated that even in an age of increasing visibility, there would always be blind spots. And within those blind spots, disciplined individuals could still operate, influence outcomes, and disappear. Modern strategists would later echo this idea using new terminology, but the foundation had already been laid decades earlier by soldiers operating with nothing more than careful planning and mutual trust. What sets this story apart is not just what was accomplished, but how it was accomplished. There was no improvisation born of desperation, no reckless gamble driven by lack of options. Every step was deliberate, every risk was calculated. The soldiers involved understood the limits of their mission and refused to exceed them, even when opportunities presented themselves. That restraint prevented escalation and ensured the operation remained invisible. In war, where excess often defines tragedy, restraint can be the most disciplined act of all. The enemy, for their part, never truly solved the mystery. Reports were filed, theories circulated, and blame assigned, but the core question remained unanswered. How had such disruption occurred without warning? How had critical systems failed without a clear point of attack? That unanswered question haunted decision-makers long after the campaign ended. It forced a reevaluation of assumptions and revealed vulnerabilities that no amount of conventional force could fully address. In that sense, the operation achieved something rare. It reshaped not only the battlefield, but the enemy's understanding of it. Years later, when fragments of declassified material finally surfaced, they did so quietly, buried in archives and footnotes. There was no grand announcement, no dramatic unveiling. Researchers pieced together timelines, cross-referenced accounts, and slowly realized that a significant chapter of the war had been hiding in plain sight. Even then, the full picture remained elusive. Some records were missing, some testimonies were incomplete, and some truths went to the grave with the men who had lived them. The hidden operation resisted full exposure, as if secrecy itself had become part of its identity. For those who study history, this presents a challenge. How do you honor actions that were designed never to be noticed? How do you tell a story built on absence rather than presence? The answer lies not in dramatization, but in understanding intent. These soldiers did not seek recognition. They sought results. They accepted anonymity as the price of effectiveness. And in doing so, they achieved a form of success that outlasted medals and headlines. Their reward was knowing that others lived because they acted when and where they did. This story also forces us to reconsider how we define impact. Popular narratives often focus on decisive battles and charismatic leaders. Yet here's an example of influence exerted quietly, incrementally, and decisively by individuals operating far from the spotlight. It reminds us that history is not only shaped by those who stand at podiums or charge across open fields, but also by those who move carefully through shadows, guided by discipline rather than glory. As time moves forward and new generations encounter this story, its relevance remains undiminished. In a world that often equates visibility with value, the hidden operation stands as a counterpoint. It argues that effectiveness does not require attention, and that some of the most meaningful contributions are those made without expectation of acknowledgement. That lesson extends beyond warfare. It speaks to leadership, to responsibility, and to the quiet strength of doing what must be done simply because it is necessary. In the end, the operation's greatest achievement may be its endurance. Not as a legend, not as a celebrated turning point, but as a persistent reminder that power can be subtle, that preparation can outweigh force, and that silence can sometimes speak louder than any declaration. The enemy never expected it, never fully understood it, and never truly countered it. And perhaps that is the truest measure of its success. The story closes not with a celebration, but with a reflection, because some victories are meant to be understood rather than applauded. The hidden operation did not end the war, did not appear in headlines, and did not produce monuments. Yet its influence quietly rippled outward, touching decisions, saving lives, and altering outcomes in ways that can never be fully measured. That is the nature of this kind of history. It does not demand attention, it waits for it. What remains most striking is how ordinary the people involved were, at least on the surface. They were not larger-than-life figures shaped by myth or legend. They were trained soldiers who trusted their preparation, trusted each other, and carried out their task with discipline rather than bravado. There were no speeches before the mission and no parades afterward. The work was done, the effects were felt, and life moved on. That quiet professionalism is easy to overlook, but it is precisely what made the operation succeed. In hindsight, it is tempting to frame the operation as inevitable, as if its success was assured once the plan was set in motion. But that would be a mistake. At every stage, failure was possible. A single misstep, a moment of hesitation, or a lapse in judgment could have exposed everything. The margin for error was almost non-existent. That the operation succeeded at all speaks not to luck, but to an exceptional level of preparation and restraint. These were individuals who understood that patience was not passive, and silence was not weakness. The operation also challenges how we think about courage. Courage is often portrayed as action taken in the face of fear, but here it was action delayed in the face of temptation. There were moments when greater destruction was possible, when bolder moves might have delivered immediate results. Those options were deliberately rejected. The soldiers involved chose the harder path, the one that required them to do less, not more. That restraint demanded confidence, discipline, and an understanding of the larger picture. It was courage expressed through control. As years passed, the men who took part aged, and eventually they were gone. Their names faded from rosters, their personal memories faded with them. What survived were fragments, hints of something significant that had occurred beyond the margins of official histories. It is only by piecing those fragments together that we begin to appreciate the scale of what they accomplished. Even now, the full story remains incomplete, shaped as much by what is missing as by what is known. And that may be fitting. The operation was never meant to be fully visible. Its success depended on remaining partially obscured, even in retrospect. There is a certain integrity in that. Not every act of service requires recognition to be meaningful. Not every contribution needs to be understood by everyone. Some are enough simply to exist, quietly shaping outcomes while asking nothing in return. For viewers today, this story offers more than historical insight. It offers perspective. It reminds us that impact is not always loud, that effectiveness does not require validation, and that some of the most important work is done by people who will never be thanked publicly. In an age that often rewards visibility above substance, that lesson feels especially relevant. It also invites us to reconsider how we honor the past. Remembering is not just about recounting events, it is about understanding values. Discipline, patience, trust, responsibility. These were the qualities that define the hidden operation, and they are qualities that remain essential far beyond the battlefield. When we recognize them in history, we recognize them in ourselves and in the choices we make when no one is watching. The enemy never expected the operation, never identified it clearly, and never found a way to counter it effectively. That alone places it among the most successful actions of its kind. But its true legacy lies elsewhere. It lies in the reminder that power can be subtle, that preparation can outweigh force, and that silence, when used with purpose, can change the course of events. This is why these stories matter, not because they glorify conflict, but because they illuminate human capability under pressure. They show what is possible when individuals act with clarity and restraint, guided by something larger than themselves. They remind us that history is not only written by those who are seen, but also by those who choose to remain unseen. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to acknowledge that resonance. Share it with someone who values history beyond headlines. Leave a comment and let us know where you're watching from, or if someone in your family served and carried their own untold story. And if you want to keep uncovering these overlooked moments, stories that were never meant to be loud but deserve to be remembered, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Every view, every comment, every subscription helps ensure that these hidden chapters of history are not lost to silence.